Thanks all to all the speakers there. I know some of you have to go into the business of the day, but we do have an opportunity here to kind of take some questions. We have these kind of UN-style question spaces. If people want to ask any questions, you just have to press the little red button and talk about it. Is there anybody who has a question out there? Okay, here we go, the delegate with the tie here.
Yeah, I'm wondering, I mean, I feel like maybe there's a duh factor to the study here. I've always been told, at least the common knowledge is that obviously younger generations tend to be more liberal than their parents and be more interested in the civil rights movement, the flower power movement, all headed up primarily by young people, and then as they get older tend to move back towards the middle or to the right when they get married and have a stable job. I mean, am I wrong? Is this something that it's obvious that the younger people are going to be more liberal?
Well, that's why we tried to throw in as many of those.
Yeah, why don't you can you press your mic there?
That's why we tried to throw in as many of those comparisons between millennials and, say, Gen X at the same age as we could, because to try to get at the difference between what you would call a cohort effect, i.e. the generation actually thinks and acts differently than other generations, is something that may likely stick with them, and an age, basically life cycle effect, that as people get older, perhaps there's things about getting older that make them change their behavior. And as far as we can tell, I think from looking at the data, there are a lot of things about this generation that do look like they're going to stick. And actually one thing that, some of the most politically salient things we know do tend to stick, like your party ID and your tendency to vote for one party over the other. I mean, there's some change over the life cycle, but there's some of those identifications that are formed at an early age or of your early part of your adult life do tend to stick with you. So the answer is that both things go on, but I think some specific generational things are going on with this group that do appear likely to stick with them and make them different than previous generations.
Well, I'll also add this. Actually, to answer you directly, what you asked is no. All young people do not vote more progressive than their parents and more Democrat than their parents. Absolutely not. In fact, we saw with Generation X that wasn't the case. In fact, they were voting very conservative and very Republican, and as opposed to this one, at the same exact ages. So when they're coming out of college and they're starting their lives and they're don't have a house and they aren't married and all the things that you say, well, maybe that would make them more progressive. It wasn't at all the case. It has a lot more to do with when you come of age, what the world situation is, how you react off your parents, how you react off against other kind of things going on in the society at that time. And the same thing about boomers. Boomers, you think it was, the 60s, this great kind of radical thing. It wasn't the case. In fact, it was essentially that generation has been split between very liberal, very conservative, and Republican, Democrat. It's been a kind of a split generation. So anyhow, they all kind of play out differently, and that's a misnomer I think that you got to challenge in just basic generational terms. Go ahead in the back. Do you want to just?
I think I can do it without.
You can just yell it. Okay, that's fine.
I just had a question for you guys, I guess, about the data that you presented about millennials' perspectives on different issues. And I noticed that education was absent from the list that you ran down. You mentioned certain kinds of inequality that seemed like a place where educational inequality might register. And I was curious whether it doesn't register, whether you think it doesn't register because people genuinely don't think that in this generation there is a problem, or whether you think there's just too much competition for concern and it's not registering.
Right, well, the data tend to show that education is more so than for older people a key issue. For millennials, it tends to show that millennials are very convinced, again, even a little bit more so than older generations, that you need a college education to get ahead in the world. But interestingly enough, they're also very convinced that that's probably not enough to get ahead in the world. In other words, they see it as a necessary but not sufficient condition. I think a lot because they do tend to see the way the work world has changed, the economic world has changed, and it makes them realize that the days of sure bets are gone, and there are a lot of challenges to you being able to have a good life, even if you do manage to get a college education. So these are all, but I think sort of the bottom line is this is a critical issue for this generation for sure, and maybe more about that in the future.
And the one thing I'll just say, the reason we chose those 5 wasn't so much that there aren't other issues that they're concerned about, but we just thought they're interesting litmus tests about how you would break a more conservative or progressive kind of way of thinking about those. And with education, it doesn't really break liberal conservative or progressive conservative that clearly, so it's harder to say because most people are all for education. Whereas when it, attitudes towards diversity, environment, and break differently. Go ahead here.
Hi, I have a similar question about national security. I'm going to turn this off because it seems like there's a lot of feedback. Seeing that.
But he needs to hear it for the video. If you can just do it, is that okay?
Seeing that a big portion of the millennial generation sort of came to age politically, at least after September 11th. Are their views of national security any more conservative than other generations?
No, the answer to that is no. I mean, there was some, people made arguments along those lines, including David Brooks, who many of you may read in the New York Times. He actually made a generational case based on, this is not uncommon with David, not any real data, but I mean, he argued that this generation that has experienced 9/11 as young people were gonna move decisively in the direction of being quite conservative in these issues, no more bullshit, we've just really got to crack down and this is a hard world out there and we got to be tough and that's what it's all about. But actually the data even after 9/11, as I think I mentioned in the presentation, tended to show young people were less, not more convinced that the way to deal with the rest of the world was to kick them in the head. And we've seen that that's continued over time. Actually, the millennial generation tends to be more oriented toward multilateralism, less oriented toward the use of military force, more convinced that the war in Iraq has been a debacle and shouldn't have been pursued as it did, and on and on and on. So no, that's just completely incorrect. They are not more conservative, they're more liberal.
Well, one thing I might add to that, and by the way, if anyone wants to jump in, even if it's not a data thing, I will add just one thing about it. This generation has been able to travel globally more than any other generation. It's now, granted, it's the more affluent members of the generation, but it's a lot of them who have studied abroad, traveled abroad, gone with the parents in a way that the boomers or previous generations didn't. So there is an interesting, plus the technology connects them to people globally. I think there's some structural things that might actually be making them think differently about the rest of the world.
And just to add one thing to this, I mean, the argument, kind of implicit in your question was the attack on 9/11 a defining event for this generation? Yes, it was in some ways, but you can't separate that from what happened afterwards. That equally, and perhaps even more so at this point, that incredible failure of the Bush administration to follow up on this in a way that was productive is just, sunk deep into, I think, to the political DNA of this generation at this point.
Go ahead, yeah, here.
Which is actually, I think, a great segue into my question, which is, you talked about the optimism of this generation, and I think one of the rules of thumb that we've been operating on is that this surge in turnout among young voters, at least to some extent, has been negatively driven, has been driven in opposition to, bad Bush policies and really striking wrong track numbers. Where do you have we unpacked that optimism at all? Is it technological? Is it is it the teen pregnancy and crime rate things you're talking about? Has that been explored at all in the data?
Does someone else want to have a crack at that?
Well, I don't think it's a necessary. I think there isn't really data to show that in the same way. I mean, why? I mean, there's maybe different speakers can speculate on why they're so optimistic.
I mean, some of it's the natural optimism of youth. We know there's a lot more optimism among this group that, in fact, we'll be able to overcome our obstacles. There's a certain kind of world-weary defeatism among older generations vis-a-vis some of America's problems, particularly in the economic realm, and millennials just aren't there. We saw some of the attitudes towards government, which I think are, quite critical. They're quite striking differences between this generation and Generation X and older people about what government is capable of doing, could potentially do. Now, we know that at the same time, millennials also tend to think our current crop of politicians is perhaps not optimal, that, they in fact don't necessarily have the public's interest in mind, and they're not doing such a great job. But their view on the potential of government, what it could do, what it could accomplish, and in fact, in some ways, the necessity for government is striking in its non-cynicism.
Heather, did you want to jump in there, or no? Okay, good. We'll just take the last couple ones, because I know the guy in the way back there. Go ahead.
I work with the social values research, and I was trying to look at some things that were interesting about millennials. And one of the things that was really fascinating to me was the vast sort of social political values. When you looked at generation that's in the 60s, sort of the post-boomer or boomer sort of age, and then looked at the millennials. When you broke those age demographics up by race, there was a lot of differences between the values held by collectively by whites, by Latinos, and by African Americans. When you got into the millennials, however, young Latinos, young whites, and young African Americans were very close to each other in the kinds of values that they have. I think, without a lot of analysis, there's a much greater shared culture now for young people than there was for people who came to the tail end of the civil rights movement. But as progressives, it does sort of impact the way that we think about how we do racial politics. That young African Americans view the political world much differently than their grandparents. The same with Latinos and to a greater extent with whites. And I was just wondering, Roy, if you have seen that on an issue basis, where there is more similarity among the ethnic groups of millennials versus some of the older groups.
I think it kind of depends on the issue, but I certainly think there are issues among, on which there is a remarkable amount of convergence. I mean, I think a lot of the social issues, things like the environment, the differences are just not that large. I think there's some other issues like, for example, affirmative action or things like that, where you might see differences that are as large, maybe just a little bit smaller. But I mean, this is an interesting area, and I actually haven't looked into it as much as I'd like. I mean, my general impression is similar to yours. There's a compression of the race-ethnic differences among this generation. They still exist, but they're smaller than among previous generations. And I guess for those of us who favor a sort of transracial progressive politics, that can't be anything but good news.
Yeah, we've found similar things in our polling, and we've looked at different race breakdowns and found consistently jobs in the economy, the war in Iraq are just at the top of the list regardless of that. And then, immigration will spike a little higher with young Latinos, or you'll see that, but it still doesn't make it to the top even. So we're seeing a convergence amongst that. And even looking at like popular culture as a mechanism for reaching them, it's more about urban culture than it is about, and so you're finding similarities in how they identify through popular culture mechanisms as well.
Well, we'd love to see what you got, Jeff, because that's a nuanced way of looking at things that it's hard to see in the data right now. Did Tim want to answer?
Yeah, sure, just real
we'll
quick.
wrap.
My impression before this event was that millennials skewed towards progressive ethics or progressive values, but we're a little bit leery about assigning themselves as Democrats necessarily. Is that accurate? Their party ID or their party affiliation? Just what kind of data did you guys find on that?
Well, if you look at the, not only, I mean, typically pollsters ask you Democratic, Republican, or Independent, but frequently it's followed up by trying to figure out how they lean. Do they lean toward the Democrats or toward the Republicans? So if you just looked at 18 to 29-year-olds, and you asked them, are you D, R, independent, you got a whole bunch of independents and greater than in the population at large. But it turns out a lot of those independents lean one way or another, and in this generation, they lean heavily Democratic. So, if you looked at the data we put up earlier, I think there's still a number of points of pure independence in the current split. I think, 49-30, like even roughly 15 points claim they don't lean toward either party, but that means that 85% do at least lean toward one party or another, and they lean heavily Democratic. So the concept that somehow their politics aren't fully formed and they're all running around and they don't really have a preference between the parties despite their progressive values, I just think this is wrong.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that, as you see young people vote for a particular party, that starts to become habit forming. And so actually the party ID for Democrats amongst young people has grown about 10 points over the past couple of years. So you're actually seeing them starting to ID more and more as Democrats. It was split a third in the late 90s, early in the century, and it's now grown about 10 points towards the Democrats. And the Democracy Corps just put out a poll yesterday, I believe, maybe even today, and broke out the 18 to 29-year-olds and saw the party ID go up even greater that. So you're
And
starting to
wasn't
see
this
a
in the
trend.
battleground districts or something?
It was
did
in
you
the
say?
battleground districts,
Which is
yeah,
like, I
the
mean,
50
that's pretty
states.
significant.
A lot of interesting things here. We got to wind it up. Thanks everyone for coming. Grab a report on the way out, and be sure to turn people onto this. Spread it around. It's good news, and people want to know about it. Thank you very much.